So hi, my name is González. Please do follow me on Twitter. I do love attention. And I'm a designer and developer, as I fear many of us in this room are today. And recently, I was a developer at The Guardian indeed. Something relevant for the context of The Guardian is that I'm Spanish. We don't have squirrels in Spain. And I was weirdly fascinated by them when I ran into them here. They're adorable. They're like rats with tails. And this is, again, relevant to The Guardian because The Guardian has the weirdest agenda against those animals. Honestly, it's a weird hill to die on, but I respect it. Now, more importantly for the context of this talk, as you can see, The Guardian is a very complex website. It has a ton of layouts with a lot of variants. All of this is necessary for carrying across the power of our stories and the power of our journalism. And we have a ton of intentional and non-intentional design variants. And you might be wondering, how do we manage this complexity? How do we actually make sure that this is all aligned and in focus? The answer is we don't really, and that's why we started looking into design systems. At the moment, theguardian.com, when I joined, it was about 1,000 lines of CSS. So we did, in fact, have a redesign also when I joined about two years ago, and it was hell on earth, and we knew we wanted a better solution. Luckily for me, I was actually in a different team. I was in subscriptions. It looks like this. We didn't really have to do math. So we're like, haha. But very soon, my team was tasked with migrating a ton of old pages that looked like this to a new platform that was more modern and that looked a bit more like this. All of this was the subscriptions pages. And the team had already built a couple landing pages in this platform. This was for our digital subscription products, and the other one was a one-pager for the Guardian app. And the thing is, they were both built ad hoc with not a lot of reusability in mind. And really, that was it. So our goal was to incorporate both newspaper and magazine subscriptions into this new website. And it seems easy. There are some clearly cool visuals going on. The only problem we ran into is that karma hit us. And by the time we started work, we had already changed our design language again. Things happen. So when we started the mockups, things were kind of the same but different. And thing is, this was an exciting point because both design-wise and business-wise, this was the first time a team had sort of cross-cutting full ownership of a couple of pages that were being designed and developed at the same time. At this point, we had different pages. They were designed by different people. They were taking different pathways to be there, but this was a chance for us to unify pages and to sort of avoid falling into the same pitfall. So when I started running into this, I can't help but see patterns. So I started really harassing our designers that at that point were just delivering us static mockups with questions like, are those the same buttons? Is this a different thing or the same header style? Why does this call to action look different? What are our text styles? You can imagine. And the poor designer who just signed themselves up to do some static mockups were like, oh my God, what? Honestly, can't really blame them. Handover is not a solved problem yet. And in my head, this is the first time design systems clicked. And we didn't have the resources or the budget to do a proper design systems initiative. So it's when I got the idea of started doing a guerrilla design system. See how I worked the first slide into this, like on a movie trailer? Yeah. Anyway, you might be wondering, what exactly is a guerrilla design system? And the short answer is, I don't know. The reason I don't know is because I don't entirely know what a design system is. By the way, super enlightening conference. But what I really mean by this, I kind of know what a design system is, as you can imagine. But what I didn't know at the time is what they actually represented to the many layers of corporate structure and stakeholders that were starting to drop the word in meetings. So for some of them, it was a component library. For others, it was brand guidelines, just a bit more polished. For others, it was this vehicle for massive cultural change. Also, if you can notice, the lady in the left is looking nowhere. That's because I cropped the image to make it more diverse. So, back to the topic at hand. Design is really applying a ton of unwritten rules as CSS is hard because it's where we actually have to write all those rules. That's something I live for as a developer. This can be all super tricky to do right, but it's super important to do right when it comes to building scalable, modular, and maintainable front-end code. It's super hard to pull off, not just because it's hard, but because of this. Basically, design systems sort of help you bypass this. And in my head, my first idea of design systems is by writing the right CSS, we can sort of create design as a system, maybe? And now, in my head, design is already a series of systems. So when you have CSS, you start specifying your constraints, your layouts, and you sort of let the browser take over and design for you. As a developer, this is a weird intersection between design and development. And I personally find this concept fascinating, so fascinating that I actually, as a hobby, will do Twitter bots like Fake Fantas, takes random HTML, random CSS, emojis, and just tries to make flavors for Fanta. I've also got one for Brexit, but let's not talk about this now. But back to more practical matters, like my job, say I'm building this page. We still have nothing in place. I could just take the CSS that Sketch or Figma or Zeppelin does for me and call it a day. And honestly, it would be so easy, like it's literally right there. There is even a copy button, it's up there, it's the squares. But as you can see, this is missing crucial context. It doesn't have our design tokens, it's not flexible. It basically contains a ton of assumptions that only make sense in the context of this design. And more importantly, perhaps, the moment any of these assumptions change or we want to reuse the component, everything falls apart. And this doesn't only happen when our assumptions change because we added a new line or whatever. It happens because the web is less of a garden and more of a battleground, I like to say it. Like there is an impossible array of different ways an end user is going to see a website. And the only thing I can tell you for sure is that very few are going to see it in a $2,000 Mac like we have. So we need to make sure CSS is resilient and that it scales. Now, to me, CSS is an amazing language to do this. It lets you specify the exact constraints you want and then apply them. And I really, really, really hate this gray box because it contains literally what the designer wanted it to look like. And if you're just trying to get the job done as a developer and get the thing out of the way, why wouldn't you just copy-paste this? Why would you bother just bothering your designers so you can ask them endless questions for hours that might make them feel like you're questioning their practice in the first place? Just to know about the intent behind a page so you can do this properly. You just copy-paste this and you're good to go. But sadly, it has consequences. And as a developer, for me, the more important ones are about performance and accessibility. So not only do we have an inconsistent design language every time, but also we have code redundancies, and this leads to larger web pages, which is always bad. And accessibility is a problem that, instead of being a solved problem, we have to solve every single time we build a website this way. So how can we fix this and encourage reuse? Maybe by having a component library. And now, this is, again, I was thinking way too much. And maybe by having a component library, we can not only encourage reuse, but by sharing the same base core element, we can not only encourage consistency today, but also keep it going through the future. And this is sort of a fresh idea on the web. But it has been done for a while on other platforms and mediums, and they already had some experiences with this. So for instance, this is Windows. Windows historically has just updated all of its components in place. So every single time you update Windows, all your UIs have the fancy, shiny new widgets. And this works to a point. Obviously, the widgets are going to look new, but places like the font style in Windows Vista, every single pixel of this screen is clickable. It's just that the entire thing looks very obviously untouched since the 90s. A polar opposite would be iOS, which does absolutely nothing to apps that aren't explicitly targeting a device or a design language. But even then, as soon as developers tick a box, everything new goes in automatically. The screen sizes, the iOS 7 redesign. And for that, developers just have to opt in, and then stakeholders can basically review the app, see what works, and make finer adjustments. Or they can't, like this app I found on the App Store today while I was looking for very old apps. Point is, there is immense power in being able to just overhaul your components and get the job almost done and need only a very little amount of manual labor. So a cool recent example of this is Twitch, the gaming website. This is how they looked a couple of months ago, and they recently got a brand refresh. And what's really interesting here is that they were able to overhaul the entire thing on launch, every single page of it. And if you look back and forth, you can see this is not really dramatic at all. Everything is sort of in the same place, but by updating the underlying system, they were able to ship a redesign on day one that covered every single area of the site. And then they were able to apply extra effort to hero areas. Now, this is the type of sheer possibility that fascinates me as a way of developing websites. I got a final example also from gaming, and I'm sorry. And this is a bit more abstract. I don't know if you know about Bethesda game studios. They make Skyrim and they make Fallout, and I'm sure they make more things, but those aren't the important ones. And the thing is, These games are massive RPGs. They're packed with levels and content, and they will take a player roughly 100 hours to complete. So you can imagine just how long they can take to make. And the thing is, Bethesda, in order to make this possible, they have invested heavily in systems, and they have invested heavily in systems for a long time. So the gist of it is when they are making levels, they will begin with these gray boxes on the top. They contain windows, they contain doors, they contain all the components to make a series of rooms and passages. At this point, the level designers can sort of start, say, wireframing a level design. And in parallel, completely out of context, the visual designers can start adding detail to a level. And then, ideally, everything comes together in the end, and you end up with a finished level that's not only super playable, because the level designers had a lot of time ahead to make things, but also beautiful. Now, this is not a very flashy example. This one isn't either. As you can see, this is a bit blocky, and admittedly, architecture is a bit blocky by itself. But this is more of an artistic choice, and less of a limitation of the system. Because again, they have been doing this for 10 years. There are amazing talks on this, such as Skyrim's modular approach to level design by Joel Burgers. And some other examples of levels you can make with this toolkit is stuff like caves, which is not blocky at all, or the Guild of Mages, which is a thing in the Fallout universe. Did I say Fallout? I meant the other one. Doesn't matter. Point is, they give talks every year, and this is really interesting to me because it's a completely different industry facing a very similar problem, and in many ways, they have already done their homework in very interesting manners that I think are worth looking at. Now, back to something way more interesting, newspapers. So, kept thinking about design systems, and maybe they are the holy grail of handovers. So, back to my team, as I said, we were building new pages from scratch, but we wanted to be a bit more smart about how to do this. So, what we can totally do at this point is we can take all the stuff that's close enough in the existing pages. We can make it flexible enough to support both styles at first, or in some cases even redesign the component in the old page as we go. So in short, it's a bit like we find a pattern, we turn them into components if they aren't already, and we reuse, reuse, reuse. And patterns don't have to look the same. If we have two separate implementations of a tab bar, that's a good moment to catch up with our designers and ask them, hey, is this on purpose? Should we just update the old one in place? And if you don't want to update the old one in place, you can pass them as props. So for example, I used everybody's favorite example, I think, buttons. We had like 4 different implementations of this in code on the site already. And you can imagine all the variants a button can have. And by that, I mean really imagine it because I lost access to the Figma file that had the buttons. So what I could do is recreate them on code. These were literally different sets of components and HTML to render what in most cases was exactly the same thing with different styles. And the thing is, most of these, just like dirt around your flat, they collect over time. Like nobody wakes up and says, I'm gonna make a different button. But we end up with a very fragmented landscape of things that make the same thing. The first step I took to fix this was calling what has to be the most productive meeting I've ever made in my entire life. And we just started going over every single button on all the pages, attempting to replace them with a unified button if we could. And if the design was significantly different, we started to explore what props we could take. We would look at the why it was different. And basically, we would either implement this as a property of a new unified button or remove the difference. Now, this required coordination across every single department. But the thing is, this was a very good way to sort of create something from scratch in a way that allowed us to figure out real-world requirements. Like this was tried and tested code that we were already running in production for years. This already had all the use cases that pop once you have designed a system and rolled it out. And it was a very good way to actually analyze every single real-world requirement and roll it into this. Now, having that said, in terms of real-world requirements, the main fundamental differences between all these buttons is that, as I found out through this session, writing more CSS is way easier than talking to people. Now, this is not just about talking to other people. For example, with the button examples, when I see many differences, or I say the font is 16 pixels instead of 15 pixels, I can use my designer past as a developer to either make a judgment call to ask a designer instead of implementing it blindly, or I can also expand the code for the button in a way that supports this new font size if it's meant to be. Honestly, something very troublesome at this point is that writing CSS is easy, but something even easier than writing CSS is copying this fucking black box. So if you look at what we did up until this point, we were basically creating a ground-up component library from existing components to solve this problem, a guerrilla design system, if you will. And this is because, at least to me, CSS is already a design system. What I mean by this is that the dynamic nature of the web means everything can change at every single point. So everything we build must be flexible in the first place. And if it's not, it will be to a point even then. And this is actually what inspired the title. If you have a website, any website, you have a poorly documented design system already. Like a guerrilla design system isn't just what we did, which was take existing components and try to unify them and in the process come up with some sort of component library. It's also just the default state of affairs of websites and the browser. So the style sheet for any website is a guerrilla design system. There is no need to have a design systems initiative. And the thing is, taming it is hard and also worthwhile to me. And when I say hard, something that has helped us a lot and that I was starting to freak out when nobody talked about this for the first 3 talks, Storybook. Now, everybody knows Storybook to the point where, let's be real, this is a thing. But what's important to us in this context is that Storybook gave us a place to surface all of these components, the new components that were flexible enough to support all the use cases we were designing for and that developers will building for. And this is awesome because we basically made the easy option the best one. We replaced copy-pasting this with copy-pasting this, which was pretty dope. Now, Storybook also lets you develop components in isolation. As you can see, you can take them out of context, identify what parts of them you can use, and basically it lets you sort of decide the granularity of your components outside of the context of the website, which is kind of cool. Since your components ideally are gonna look the same as all their components you have that kind of look the same as others, you can just replace them in place and in a way gaslight your stakeholders. This is, by the way, our actual Storybook, and it's a complete embarrassment. It has been called by some Guardian staffers the anti-design system, but also it does solve the goals we were set out to solve, which is pretty neat. Since this initiative took place, it's been about 6 months. We did reduce bundle sizes. We did get a more consistent design in the end. You might be wondering, what did we learn from this all? What did we learn from trying to build a design system from the ground up, a sort of like almost a developer help tool? It was more like adding a testing library than building a proper design system. The answer is, as you may imagine from a bunch of talks that we had, not a lot. So I had a look at the subscriptions website the other day to write this talk, and we have new buttons, we have new forms, we have new layouts, we have new developers who are not reading the documentation and they're reaching into the CSS and editing it manually. It's a bit of a disaster. And thing is, same as with the company definitions, I personally learned a lot, but it's almost honestly hard for me to intuitively tell you how much of this was sort of like an over-engineered vanity project and how much of this delivered value to the current team. Now, the things we can measure as engineers did get better. So page size went down, load times went, down. But development velocity went way up because we already had all of this in place. And the things we can measure from users, like retention and bounce rate and time on page, they did not get worse, which honestly is always what we want to hope for when you're doing sort of this transformation. So all in all, this was a fun experience. The Guardian now has a proper design systems tool that is sort of like taking the baton and starting from this point to deliver a more comprehensive design system that will hopefully reach theguardian.com. But I'm going to leave you with sort of like what this taught me, what doing this taught me, and that I'm hoping to carry across to my next projects. So first of all, I think it's always a good idea to catalog your UI using Storybook or similar. This was the first time I used Storybook and I fell in love with it. whether you're a designer or a developer, Storybook is going to allow you to think in a more systematic way about how everything you are building fits together into a more comprehensive whole. And you should do this at about any size. You should do this from the beginning of your component. You don't have to wait for your company to have a massive design system initiative, although we do have one now. Because again, if you have a design, you have a design system. And if you don't have a design system, what you are saying is that your design system has zero documentation. And honestly, I think the best case possible for a design system like this, for a Guerrilla design system, is that eventually the proper design systems initiative will be able to take over and you can just replace your components in place with the new components. And honestly, you lost nothing. You had a better development experience from day one. And in the meantime, you learned a lot. Now, cataloging your UI will allow you to find patterns. And this is where it gets a bit interesting in terms of collaboration between developers and designers. Every new component we build has a cognitive cost for the user, but also a money cost for the business, as we have to actually build it and test it and iterate on it. So having a bird's eye view of everything we have already built lets us make smarter choices about what we should build and what we should iterate on. So for instance, your modal close button is probably still a button, it just doesn't have a text to support a button with no icons. You can invert your tab bar styles and put it in the header and make the main navigation. Something important that's never fully done is making sure other people who are not you know about this. So make sure your immediate team knows. Talk about this in code reviews, encourage people to use the components. Talk about this with designers, encourage them to not only use the components, but also contribute to the components themselves. Talk about this to your team at large. Something you can do is you can sort of like barge into the company all hands dressed up like a button to really impress them. Now, I did this. You do not have to do this. I did this. Kind of worked, to be honest. But anyway, and finally, a final dirty secret is that a lot of this work was also able to happen because two of our designers in our team were client-side developers themselves anyway, and I myself came from a design background. So not only we knew what we were doing and had endless patience and respect for each other, but also we sort of wanted to do this in the first place, so it was like putting unpaid overtime in a way. But more importantly, this type of synergy between design and development, it was crucial to all of this happening in the first place. And it's rarer than it should. And thing is, as long as we develop our own UIs in code, every single handoff we do is going to be from a parcel abstraction in a design tool that goes to a completely different abstraction in code. Users are not going to see our wireframes or our mockups. They see web pages and apps. So the best design handoff is always going to be the one that doesn't exist in the first place. And in the meantime, we got to work more to understand each other and work together. And the thing is, this might sound like a diss on designers all along, but just between us, I'm tired of this should designers code question. For the only reason that most designers I've met can code. Like, CSS is not that hard. The main problem for me is that most coders I've met can't design for shit. And honestly, a little here can go a long way. Like, if designers can figure out Flexbox and CSS Grid, you can honestly figure out the basics of composition and hierarchy, and you can, at the very least, make some informed guesses about why things look the way they do and contribute to more healthy conversations. And with this, I'm out. Thank you so much for your time.